So I should preface this by saying that I prefer naturally carbonating my beer with a priming sugar. It typically leads to a more complex flavor with your beer, and it just kind of adds a little bit more, but that way takes more time. So if you don't want to wait 2 weeks to drink your beer and you've got some sort of kegerator or draft system at home, you can force carbonate it. I've got a hazy IPA today that I'm going to do just that with. The CO2 in my kegerator splits into 3, so if yours is the same, you're going to want to turn off the ones that you're not going to be using so that you don't put extra CO2 into beers you already have on tap. So before you carbonate your beer, you're going to want it to be cold, because when the liquid is cold, it's going to absorb the CO2 better. So I kegged this beer yesterday and left it in the fridge for about 24 hours to get cold. Another thing that's important once you've kegged it is you want to make sure that you've burped off any oxygen that might be left in here. And before you carbonate it and you're shaking it up, you definitely don't want any oxygen to be mixed into your beer, because that will oxidize it. I'm just gonna, for good measure, burp this one a couple more times. Make sure that your PSI is low, maybe around 5 PSI. We want to be pretty gentle when burping. We're just removing oxygen. So basically we're forcing in CO2. We're gonna burp this, and then we're going to let it refill for about 15-20 seconds, and we'll do this about 3 or 4 times over. Okay, once you've burped it a few times, you're going to want to turn the pressure up to somewhere between 20 and 30 psi. Again, making sure that you've shut off any other CO2 sources, because you don't want to pump that much CO2 into your other beers. Okay, so once you've turned it up, you'll hear the CO2 rush into your beer. Now it's time to shake. Normally you'd want to lay your beer on the ground, but the CO2 lines in my system are quite short that I basically have to prop the keg up on my knee. So just excuse that awkwardness here. You're going to want to make sure that the CO2 side is up. So any headspace in your beer, you want to be in line with this CO2 spot, because this is basically a better surface area for more of the beer to absorb the CO2. So normally you'd time this, but the way I like to do it is I like to count out the shakes. So typically I'm gonna give about maybe 150 to 200 shakes depending on where I'm going, and they're not very vigorous. They're pretty gentle back and forth. But what I want is, I wanna hear the CO2 filling. So you'll hear CO2 inside the keg. You want to find that middle ground between a gentle shake but CO2 actually filling. Okay, and once that's done, you want to leave it for at least a couple hours. I usually leave it for about a day for the CO2 to get well absorbed by the beer. So the final thing I'll say is get ready for some trial and error. This is the hardest way to get a desired carbonation level in your beer. It's the least calculated way to go. So in my experience, if you start small, maybe about 100 shakes, give it a few hours, try the beer. You can always add 50 shakes here, wait another couple hours, and so on until you get to that desired carbonation for whatever beer you've brewed. And that's a lot easier than trying to deal with an overcarbonated beer. So start slowly and go from there. I'm sure that your beer is going to taste great anyways. Thanks for watching. Even if your CO2 lines are long, you can prop it up on your knee like me and call it a home workout. And it gets you beer too, so